This mob is known as the Hivery Quiver, a neutral or hostile mob, and it actually consists of two mobs to become something new. A beehive is attached to the top of the quiver plant part of this mob by tangling its vines around the base of the hive. It's a beneficial relationship for both, as the bees provide the quiver plant protection, and the bees have flowers to pollinate. The quiver plant also provides something like a mobile home, resulting in different flowers to discover for the bees. Perhaps aggravating this hivery mob will cause the bees to come after the player, but this unique relationship has resulted in no ordinary bees. These bees have become covered in moss and quiver plants, covering the bee's stinger with a sharp plant-like spike, so these bees could sting over and over without being affected. So let's talk about the new shield that you could obtain from this mob. You would actually need to obtain the wooden shield itself from the shielded outer flower. I will talk more about this mob in a bit, and I also made a new design for the shielded outer flower for shirt stickers and merchandise if you're interested. But back to the concept. You would need to obtain 2 shield pieces from this mob. You would then need to obtain 4 quiver flowers from the hivery mob. Lastly, you would need to collect a special quiver hive from this mob by defeating it. Perhaps one way to battle it would be to plant down multiple different types of flowers in order to distract the hivery bees. Anyway, if you combine all of these items together that I've just mentioned, you will obtain the hivery shield. As you can see, this is a shield with a beehive on it, and on that beehive are 4 quiver flowers. Now, of course, there would be a group of hivery bees in your shield's hive. So let's talk about some functions of the shield. This move is known as the melee planter. So the player would have the ability to melee an opponent and in the process would plant a quiver flower onto them. This could act as a clear indicator for the hivery bees to go in battle wherever you plant these flowers. They could also bring the quiver flowers back with them so that you could continue to perform this move. But if you plant all 4 of these quiver flowers onto something, you could perform a move known as the hivery tether. The idea is that the flowers could connect and tangle their vines together along with the shield to lift mobs up, and even throw them. I think that being able to throw mobs at other mobs could be fun. This mob is called the blooming smudgelet, and it's the result of a forgotten farm. This dirt-like mob can be observed walking around using a couple of wooden fence posts as legs, its roots tangling around these posts and cleverly using them to maneuver around. Many wooden tools are often discarded, and some of those tools are given a new use by being wielded and appreciated by the smudgelets. I like the connection between this mob and the wooden tools, as they both consist of plant-like materials, which initially could have been the reason that the smudgelets were drawn to the wooden tools. I'm thinking that this would be a neutral mob depending on how you treat your surroundings. And while this mob could shovel up out of the dirt from anywhere, I'm thinking that the main area of dirt that they would appear in would be from this new structure here. I'll get to the reason as to why the player would even want to poke around in the soils of this land in a bit, but let's go ahead and talk about one of the moves of the blooming smudgelet. I call this the shoveling plant punch. This move would allow the smudgelet to reach the player even if the player is a few blocks away. Perhaps this mob wouldn't be the most difficult to battle. However, the more neglected a farm is, the more likely it is for the smudgelet flowers to begin to appear, just like this one. This flower here would eventually then grow into a blooming smudgelet mob, almost like a visual reminder to the player to take care of their surroundings. Perhaps not planting a sapling after chopping down a tree or discarding a wooden tool would also cause a smudgelet flower to bloom. So the more smudgelets that appear, the more fun and engaging this battle could be. Perhaps if the player takes good care of their surroundings, a friendly smudgelet could shovel up out of the dirt and battle alongside of the player. This mob could also potentially drop a rare wooden item. This item is called the greenery pick. Now, this is some fantasy logic, but like my wooden pincer sword concept, this item is also as durable as iron because of the vines holding the wooden pick together on the inside and outside, therefore increasing the durability of this item. Now, if you use this item in its current state, it could mine quicker, but it would still basically be a pretty basic tool. But in order to change that, we will need to revisit this concept later on in the video. By the way, feel free to check out the light mode version of this video if you're watching during the day and would prefer a clean and vibrant look. So let's talk about this flower here. This flower is called the outer flower, as in counter flower, and it will turn into a hostile mob known as the shielded outer flower. And I'm thinking that this would be more of a boss type mob. This mob can be observed using a archaeology pot as a mobile home, and much like the smudgelets, the shielded outer flower also uses its vines to grab onto these wooden posts to maneuver around. Lastly, and as you can see, this mob is also known for wielding a broken shield. One thing that this mob does is a melee or arrow shielding type move. So this mob wouldn't be able to be defeated from a distance, and the outer flower would also use these shield pieces for melee moves if the player was in its range. You might also notice the flower-like symbol on the archaeology pot, and this would be a new archaeology pot shard, and I want you to remember this as it's a concept that I'll be bringing up again. So let's talk about this flower here. This is called the bubbler flower, and when removed from the archaeology pot, it will turn into a friendly or neutral mob known as the bubbler plantalet. This mob is actually grown in an archaeology pot, and the rim of the pot can actually be seen around the plantalet's abdomen. I think this tells a fun, subtle story about this mob. Now, as you can see, this mob is actually holding a couple of bubbles, and you might wonder what that's about. And in a way, this is actually something that some plants can do in real life. It's actually pretty fascinating, but certain plants are actually able to be used to blow bubbles. So, as usual, I like to take ideas from real life and add a bit of fantasy. So the bubbler plantalet is actually able to make bubbles similarly. So one of the moves this plantalet could perform is called the bubbler's locket. I'm thinking that this mob could blow a bubble for a couple of reasons. The first being the ability to lift a player or a mob if this bubble comes into contact with them. This would likely be the case if this mob had become hostile. Now the other idea is related to this item here. This item is called the planterly pod. This pod is actually the seed casing that the bubbler plantalet originally comes from. This pod is actually something that could be retrieved by the player by looking around in the dirt specifically near this new structure. I do, however, like the idea of these planterly pods being able to be discovered in random chunks of dirt anywhere, but just very rarely. I am also thinking that looking for a planterly pod near the structure would cause the blooming smudgelets to appear. I'm thinking that this would make for some fun game design. I'd like to talk about the process of growing your own plantalet more in a bit, but for now, let's get back to the bubble concept. At some point in the process, you will end up with an empty planterly pod. This pod can actually hold a few items. And if you grow your own bubbler, you could place the item-filled pod on the ground. The bubbler will then blow a bubble that will lift up and send your items to your base. Perhaps planting some type of special flower at your base could act as an indicator for where the item should float to. I also really like the idea of the player normally exploring, and when the player looks up, there might be a random bubble with a planterly pod in it. This could be a really pleasant surprise that the player could burst with an arrow. Imagine how exciting it would be to see one out in the wild, and how fun it would be to guess what unique item could be contained within the pod. I also think that this idea makes sense as well due to the bubbler plantalet being a friendly mob. I can imagine this plantalet mob putting together a gift and releasing it into the lands for an unsuspecting traveler. Now, as some of you might already know, I like to connect my concepts together, and I would like to do just that by introducing a new attachment for my archaeology glove concept. This attachment is known as the bubbler attachment. But before I explain how this item works, allow me to explain how the player actually obtains this attachment. I mentioned the idea of the new flower archaeology shard, and this is a shard that the players would need to obtain and place in an archaeology pot to be able to grow their own plantalets. Only planterly pods could be placed within these specific pots, which I think balances things out, as the player would need to find a planterly pod, flower shard, and use a archaeology pot. And while the plantalets could be befriended as normal companions if you like, for this idea, instead of the plantalet becoming a companion mob that follows you around, you would take the bubbler and plant or attach it to the front of your archaeology glove. So it's almost like a mob that you could wear on your arm. So this attachment can do a couple of things. The first move is known as the bubbler's wind. As you can see, many bubbles are released, and this causes the smudgelets to melt into the ground. So this move would be very effective against the smudgelets. I also like the idea that the same type of thing would happen to the smudgelets when it rains. The next move is similar to the bubbler's locket, and while the player could still lift up mobs, the player wouldn't be able to send planterly pods home. I think that concept should remain with the bubbler plantalet, as I think it keeps the mob special when compared to the attachment. So this would give the player a reason to have them both. If you pick up the microphone, they won't be able to hear me. Can you still hear me? Well, the bubble will burst at some point. Oh, looks like the moment is now. So let's talk about this flower here. This is called the flamer flower, and it's another plantlet mob that the player could discover. And when removed from the archaeology pot, it will turn into a hostile or neutral mob known as the flamer plantlet. So you might wonder what exactly a flame has to do with plants. Well, in real life, some plants are actually able to produce a flammable powder. So once again, I will use this idea and put a bit of a spin on it. This plantlet can also be observed holding a couple pieces of flint. So take a look at this first move, and then I will explain. This move is known as the flamer's ignition, and basically this plantlet releases a puff of powder and very quickly sparks its flint together in order to ignite the powder, resulting in quite the display. It happens so quickly that I would actually like to slow it down for you so you can properly see the flint igniting the powder. Now, if you find a flamer plantlet pod and perform the same process of obtaining the previous attachment, you will obtain the flamer attachment. And just like the plantlet, you can perform the flamer's ignition. I also like the idea that this move could launch a glowing light source. I think that would make lighting up tall caves more enjoyable without the need to build up so high. Now, the next idea for this attachment is related to the shielded outer flower. Take a look and I will explain. As the outer flower is very good at blocking, this makes it tough to land a hit on this mob. But if you use the flamer's ignition against this mob, it would cause the iron of the shield to drastically heat up and become too hot for the outer flower to block with it properly. This would be your chance to get a few swings in. So let's talk about the greenery pick concept again. Once dropped by the blooming smudgelet, the player must place it within the vines and roots right here. The player must then collect a flower piece from each of the mobs that I mentioned in this video. This can be done by defeating the blooming smudgelet and shielded outer flower, and befriending the bubbler and flamer plantlets. Next, the player would place each flower piece onto the greenery pick. This would combine all of the properties of these mobs to craft something new, known as the foliage pick. While I've only designed a single concept for this item, I still think that it would be something worth obtaining. Now, take a look at this. The basic idea is that this would become a tool that will break down a block after being clicked on a single time. So you could click on multiple blocks and they would each break. I like the idea of this being able to affect all types of blocks, almost like a multi-purpose tool. Of course, it wouldn't break down certain blocks as quickly as others, but I still think it could be a fun idea.